In the sprawling outskirts of a small American town, the streets had taken on the late afternoon glow of fading sunlight, casting long shadows against weathered brick and asphalt. Jack, a man who had spent his life navigating modest jobs and unremarkable days, was walking past a crumbling diner when he noticed an elderly man struggling to gather his scattered belongings. The man's clothes were worn and patched, his face weathered with the kind of lines that told stories of battles both public and private, yet his eyes held a sharp clarity, a spark that suggested he had seen more than anyone in the town would imagine. Jack didn't hesitate. He approached and offered a hand, helping to lift the heavier bundles. There was a quiet dignity in the man's posture, a subtle acknowledgement that he had been treated unfairly by life, yet refused to let it define him entirely. As Jack assisted him to a nearby bench, he felt a strange sense of reverence, though he could not yet understand why. The man introduced himself simply as Emerson, speaking with a calm authority that seemed at odds with his appearance. The encounter, seemingly mundane, left a deep impression on Jack. Something about Emerson radiated a weight of unspoken experience, of battles fought in silence, of resilience forged through unseen trials. Jack found himself compelled to spend more time with him, offering small acts of kindness, coffee, conversation, guidance, without realizing that these simple gestures were threading the beginning of a life-altering narrative. Each word Emerson spoke carried subtle lessons about patience, perception, and the hidden layers of human character. The town around them seemed oblivious, bustling with its routine indifference, but Jack noticed the small ripples of respect that Emerson's presence created. Neighbors began to look twice. Street corners witnessed quiet nods of recognition, and even the local shopkeepers hesitated before passing judgment on the old man. It was as though Emerson's aura, built on decades of unseen authority, quietly demanded acknowledgement. Jack, intrigued and increasingly protective, began to document these moments in a small journal, noting every nuanced interaction, every hint of wisdom that Emerson unconsciously shared. Little did Jack know this ordinary act of assistance would soon become the catalyst for revelations that would shake the town to its core. Days turned into weeks, and Jack's routine of assisting Emerson became a ritual filled with unexpected insights. They walked together through the streets, Emerson sharing anecdotes of his youth, tales of courage in situations Jack could barely imagine, of decisions that weighed heavily on conscience, of loyalty tested under impossible circumstances. As he listened, Jack began to notice an uncanny precision in Emerson's observations, a strategic clarity that suggested a past far beyond the ordinary experiences of the neighborhood. One afternoon they passed the local elementary school. Emerson paused, observing a group of children arguing over a game. In mere moments he diffused the situation, not through intimidation, but through quiet, commanding presence and an almost instinctive understanding of human behavior. Jack watched in awe as the children obeyed the gentle authority without resentment, their conflict resolved simply because Emerson understood the human heart in ways Jack had never known. A slow realization began to form in Jack's mind. This man, though seemingly poor and forgotten, carried a mastery of leadership and consequence that far exceeded the ordinary measures of success in the world. As they continued their walks, Emerson shared snippets of his life, carefully framed to teach lessons without revealing his full identity. He spoke of missions and responsibilities, of loyalty and sacrifice, of moments where a single choice had altered the fate of many. Jack absorbed every word, sensing that Emerson's past was not merely impressive, it was monumental, though cloaked in ordinary appearance. The paradox of a man so powerful yet so understated created an emotional tension in Jack, blending admiration, curiosity, and a burgeoning sense of obligation to honor the quiet legacy of the stranger he now considered a mentor. Meanwhile, the town itself remained mostly unaware of the presence of someone who had once commanded immense respect and responsibility. Yet subtle shifts began to occur. Neighbors whispered their curiosity. Children recounted lessons learned from the old man's calm interventions. and Jack felt a growing responsibility to protect Emerson from those who might misunderstand his quiet power. The bond between the two men deepened, establishing the foundation for a story that would ultimately reveal that sometimes the greatest strength is hidden beneath the most unassuming surface, and the smallest acts of kindness can awaken truths that the world is unprepared to witness. Jack began noticing subtle changes in the way the neighborhood interacted with Emerson. People who had previously ignored or avoided the elderly man now offered cautious greetings, small nods, hesitant smiles. There was an unspoken acknowledgement, almost reverent, that this was a person whose life contained truths far beyond appearances. Emerson never claimed attention or recognition. He moved quietly, like a shadow brushing against the edges of awareness, influencing events without ever stepping into the spotlight. Jack, however, could sense the weight of this hidden legacy pressing upon him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the town in shades of amber and rust, Emerson recounted an event from decades earlier, a story of a critical mission that had gone unnoticed by the public, but had saved countless lives. He described in precise detail the decisions he had made under pressure, the people whose fates rested on his choices, and the silent burden he had carried ever since. Jack listened, captivated, feeling the gravity of these confessions settle around them like a tangible presence. The words conveyed more than heroism. They conveyed the loneliness of responsibility, the isolation of having power, but no avenue for acknowledgement. During this time, Jack began to understand the broader impact of Emerson's existence. He observed how the elderly man interacted with the most overlooked members of society, the street vendors, the elderly widows, the veterans struggling with invisible wounds. Each small act of attention or kindness revealed layers of empathy and strategic awareness that few could comprehend. Emerson noticed patterns, risks, and opportunities where others saw only chaos. Jack realized that Emerson's life was a lesson in both humility and discipline, demonstrating that leadership and honor do not require accolades. They require consistent, invisible action. The community slowly began to mirror the values Emerson silently imparted. Conflicts were resolved with more patience. Children showed emerging respect for elders, and Jack documented each subtle change in his journal. He felt the weight of responsibility, understanding that the revelation of Emerson's true identity could cause upheaval but also inspire transformation. Every encounter, every shared story, was a thread weaving a tapestry of redemption, not just for Emerson, but for the town and for Jack, who was learning to recognize the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary.
Emerson's daily routines became increasingly intricate, balancing the delicate line between invisibility and influence. Jack observed that the elderly man had an almost preternatural ability to anticipate outcomes, to maneuver events without exerting visible control. One afternoon, a local dispute erupted between two shopkeepers over a contract disagreement. As the argument escalated, Emerson arrived, not as a mediator in the conventional sense, but as a presence so commanding and grounded that the tension evaporated almost instantly. His words were few, his gaze deliberate, and the resolution came not from authority imposed, but from understanding quietly communicated. Jack felt both awe and a growing sense of duty, realizing that he was witnessing the refinement of a lifetime of disciplined leadership. Evenings were spent on long walks through neglected streets, where Emerson shared cryptic reflections on duty, morality, and resilience. He spoke of the importance of observing before acting, of listening to the unspoken, of discerning character through the smallest gestures. Jack took meticulous notes, capturing the essence of Emerson's philosophy, recognizing that these lessons were not abstract. They were practical tools for navigating a world often blind to subtlety. Each revelation added weight to Jack's perception, Emerson was not merely an extraordinary man, he was a living archive of wisdom and morality, a bridge between the visible and invisible forces shaping their community. One rainy night, as the wind carried the scent of wet asphalt and distant pine, Jack noticed Emerson pausing by a mural depicting local veterans. Emerson's hand hovered above the painted faces, a silent tribute to sacrifices unrecognized by society. Jack felt the depth of unspoken grief and pride emanating from the man beside him. The rain fell harder, yet Emerson stood still, absorbing the rhythm of the city and the echo of lives he had touched and safeguarded. The moment was both solemn and enlightening, a profound lesson in endurance, humility, and the quiet exertion of influence. Jack's understanding deepened. Emerson's true power lay not in accolades or visible control, but in the persistent, unseen commitment to justice and empathy. The town, oblivious to the scope of the man's past, was unknowingly shaped by his presence, molded into a community capable of recognizing and valuing the quiet heroism around them. Jack, now acutely aware of the magnitude of Emerson's hidden life, felt the inevitability of revelation approaching, a climax that would forever alter their lives and challenge the very perceptions of power and honor that the town had long held. As Jack spent more time with Emerson, he began to see the traces of a life shaped by history, decisions made in moments when the world held its breath. Emerson spoke rarely about specific missions, but when he did, every detail was meticulously chosen, each word painting the intensity of situations that could have ended in catastrophe. Jack imagined those nights in foreign lands, the distant sounds of conflict, the weight of decisions that could tip the balance between survival and devastation. It was impossible not to feel the gravity of that life, and Jack became acutely aware of the resilience required to carry such experiences silently for decades. One afternoon, Emerson led Jack to a small, abandoned library at the edge of town. The shelves were filled with worn books, letters, and maps, artifacts from campaigns long concluded, documents that spoke of strategy, ethics, and human complexity. As Jack sifted through these fragments, he realized that Emerson's influence had been woven into society in subtle ways, through mentorship, discreet guidance, and the quiet safeguarding of communities at risk. Every note, every annotation revealed a mind not only brilliant, but profoundly moral, capable of seeing consequences far beyond immediate perception. The depth of Emerson's history was matched only by the isolation it created. Jack observed moments when the elderly man would pause, staring at the horizon as if seeing events unfold in multiple timelines simultaneously. Those silences were heavy with memory, with responsibility, and with unspoken regrets. Yet within those silences was also clarity, a steadfast dedication to preserving life, dignity, and integrity even when recognition was impossible. Jack began to understand that Emerson's life was a testament to the principle that true heroism often goes unseen, measured not in accolades, but in the enduring impact on others. The small town itself began to shift under Emerson's silent guidance. Conflicts that had persisted for years, disputes over property, small injustices between neighbors, and misunderstandings among local businesses started resolving in unexpected ways. People acted with greater empathy, listened more attentively, and considered consequences with newfound depth. Jack realized that Emerson's influence was less about direct intervention and more about cultivating an awareness that allowed individuals to make better choices themselves. The town's moral compass, once blurred by indifference or self-interest, was gradually recalibrating. One morning, Emerson took Jack to the outskirts of the city, to a neglected veterans cemetery, where markers leaned and weeds had taken over paths. There, in silence, he tended to graves of men and women whose sacrifices had faded from public memory. Jack watched as Emerson cleared debris, straightened weathered plaques, and whispered names with solemn reverence. Each gesture was deliberate, methodical, and filled with personal history. Jack felt the weight of unacknowledged heroism, the kind that did not demand applause, only acknowledgement from the world it quietly served. As they returned through the streets, Jack noticed small gestures emerging from the community, shops leaving free coffee for veterans, children assisting elderly residents, and neighbors checking on one another with genuine care. Emerson's influence, subtle and persistent, was shaping a network of ethical engagement, a living testament to the values he had upheld for decades. Jack felt increasingly responsible, understanding that the revelation of Emerson's full identity would not merely alter perceptions, it could catalyze profound shifts in social consciousness, inspiring both admiration and self-reflection. That evening, Jack reflected on the lessons embedded in every act, every pause, every expression of quiet power. Emerson's life demonstrated that redemption is a force capable of transforming both the giver and the receiver. Each day reinforced the notion that visibility is optional, impact is not. And in this unfolding story, Jack recognized that his role was not to amplify the man's fame, but to internalize the wisdom and perpetuate it through action, understanding, and unwavering moral engagement.
The town's awareness of Emerson's subtle guidance grew in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. Neighbors began sharing stories about the elderly man's past kindnesses, anecdotes that had been overlooked for decades. Jack listened carefully, recording each fragment of memory in his notebook, sensing that these stories were threads in a tapestry far larger than he could yet perceive. Emerson, however, remained detached from recognition. He moved through the streets with the same measured pace, the same careful attention to detail, never allowing pride or ego to dictate his actions. One afternoon, Jack accompanied Emerson to a local community center, hosting a gathering for young veterans. Emerson's presence was initially met with polite nods and subdued greetings. People respected him without knowing why. As he spoke quietly to a group of former soldiers, offering guidance about resilience, patience, and ethical decision-making, Jack observed the subtle shift in the room. Conversations softened, tension eased, and a sense of unity began to permeate the space. Emerson did not demand attention. He simply existed in a way that encouraged others to recognize and cultivate their own moral strength. Later that evening, as they walked along the quiet streets, Jack asked Emerson about the cumulative effect of decades of silent service. Emerson paused, reflecting on the question, and finally replied, "Recognition is irrelevant, Jack. What matters is the alignment between intention and action. The rest follows in its own time." Jack understood that these words were not merely philosophical. They were a guide for living with integrity. Emerson's life was a continuous demonstration that true influence does not rely on public acknowledgement. It relies on the authenticity of every choice, every decision, every small act that ripples outward in ways invisible to the observer. In the days that followed, Jack noticed the town's young adults beginning to emulate these values. School children assisted elderly neighbors without being asked. Shopkeepers offered assistance to strangers, and local officials began incorporating fairness and compassion into municipal decisions. Each of these shifts, seemingly minor, was a manifestation of Emerson's hidden influence, a testament to the enduring power of moral courage. As the weeks turned into months, Emerson's past began to intersect more tangibly with the present. Jack uncovered old letters, photographs, and commendations that revealed the depth of the man's service.
a life marked by extraordinary courage, careful strategy, and unwavering commitment to protecting those unable to defend themselves. Each document was a revelation, a piece of a complex mosaic that illustrated not only military acumen, but also profound empathy. Jack realized that Emerson's choices had often prioritized human life over personal gain, safety, or recognition. Missions that could have elevated him into the public eye were executed in secrecy, their outcomes quietly preserving communities and individuals from harm. The elderly man's heroism was not performative. It was ethical, deliberate, and consistently selfless. Jack felt a mixture of awe and responsibility, understanding that sharing this story required nuance, respect, and fidelity to the character of Emerson's hidden life. During one particularly reflective evening, Jack and Emerson visited a small local park where veterans gathered to honor the unspoken sacrifices of their peers. Emerson walked among the attendees, offering brief smiles, nods, and silent acknowledgement. No speeches were made, no fanfare occurred. Yet Jack could sense the weight of Emerson's presence, the reassurance it offered, the unspoken inspiration it transmitted. In that moment, Jack understood that redemption was not a solitary achievement. It was relational. It manifested through connections, guidance, and the silent shaping of lives around a single ethical core. Jack began to see that the revelation of Emerson's identity, when it eventually came, would not be a mere spectacle. It would be the culmination of decades of careful, patient influence, a demonstration that true honor is often invisible until the moment when the world can no longer ignore it. And in understanding this, Jack embraced the responsibility of carrying the narrative forward, not for fame, but to honor the quiet dignity of a life lived with purpose. The days following Emerson's quiet interventions at the community center were filled with subtle yet undeniable shifts in the town. Jack observed as neighbors who had once ignored one another now engaged in brief but meaningful conversations. A small baker, who often hurried past the elderly without a glance, offered a warm loaf of bread to a widow struggling with groceries. Children, who had previously avoided elderly residents, began helping them with daily tasks, asking questions about life experiences and listening intently to their stories. All of this, Jack realized, was a direct reflection of Emerson's unassuming influence. Emerson himself remained the same. He continued his routines, walking slowly through familiar streets, tending to minor repairs around the neighborhood, and assisting those in need without fanfare. Despite the growing reverence people displayed toward him, he never altered his behavior to accommodate their admiration. His actions were deliberate, guided by decades of discipline and a deep understanding of human nature. Jack noted how Emerson's presence seemed to encourage self-reflection among those around him. People did not act out of obligation, but out of an emergent sense of moral clarity, inspired by the man's quiet consistency. One evening, as the sun set over the rooftops, Emerson and Jack visited a small riverside park, where children played near the water while their parents watched from nearby benches. Emerson paused, observing the interactions with a serene gaze. He finally spoke, his voice steady and unassuming. "Every small act compounds, Jack. You may not notice it now, but the influence of one life aligned with integrity spreads far beyond what the eye can see." Jack nodded, absorbing the weight of those words. He understood that Emerson's influence was not a spectacle for immediate recognition. It was a slow, enduring force that reshaped lives in the quietest ways. In that moment, Jack recognized that the essence of true leadership and heroism lay in restraint, patience, and the unwavering commitment to doing what is right, regardless of visibility or praise. In the following weeks, the ripple effects of Emerson's hidden life became increasingly tangible. Stories of his past deeds began to emerge from the corners of the town. A retired teacher recalled how Emerson had once intervened to protect a neighborhood child from a potentially dangerous situation decades ago, doing so without seeking recognition. An elderly store owner recounted how Emerson had quietly paid off debts for struggling families, never asking for acknowledgement. These fragmented narratives painted a portrait of a man whose life had been defined by service, empathy, and discretion. Jack spent hours piecing together these stories, combining them with the documentation he had discovered. Each letter, photograph, and anecdote revealed a facet of Emerson's life that had long been hidden. It was a life of extraordinary discipline and profound humanity, where acts of courage were measured not by medals or public acclaim, but by the tangible, positive impact on those around him. Jack felt both humbled and inspired, recognizing that Emerson's path was a blueprint for ethical living, a demonstration of how redemption can manifest through consistent, purposeful action. One morning, as the first light of dawn broke across the rooftops, Emerson guided Jack to a small, secluded garden at the edge of town. The air was crisp, the faint scent of blooming flowers lingering as birds began their morning songs. Emerson knelt by a weathered bench, motioning for Jack to sit beside him. Redemption, Jack, is not something you claim. It is something you cultivate. Every choice, every small intervention is a seed. Some take years to bloom, and some are never seen, but all matter if sown with intention. Jack contemplated these words, feeling the weight of responsibility settle in his chest. He realized that the story he had begun to document was not merely a tale of past heroism. It was a testament to the transformative power of quiet integrity, the enduring influence of a life committed to others, and the inevitability of recognition when the world is ready to receive it. And in understanding this, Jack understood that Emerson's redemption was not a singular event. It was the culmination of decades of unseen acts, a mosaic of patience, courage, and unwavering ethical clarity. And he vowed silently to ensure that the lessons embedded in this hidden life would be honored, shared, and preserved for those who were ready to learn from them.
In the weeks following the quiet acts of generosity, the neighborhood began to feel a subtle shift in its atmosphere. Streets that had once been lined with suspicion and whispered judgments now echoed with small gestures of kindness. Children played openly on the sidewalks, their laughter carrying across the blocks, while neighbors exchanged greetings that had been absent for years. Even those who had always been cautious or distant found themselves drawn into this ripple of unspoken empathy. Jack walked beside Mr. Anderson as they visited local shops and food stands, observing how the older man's reputation had begun to precede him in small, almost imperceptible ways. The cashier at the corner store, who had rarely looked anyone in the eye, now smiled warmly at the sight of Mr. Anderson entering. A young mother paused while carrying groceries, nodding in quiet acknowledgement, and even the elderly veterans who had once ignored him now shared stories of gratitude and admiration. It was as if the mere presence of a man who had lived a life of service, humility, and hidden greatness had awakened something dormant in the hearts of those around him. During a slow walk through a sunlit park, Mr. Anderson spoke, his voice carrying a calm authority. "Jack, the measure of a life well lived is not in recognition or reward, but in the quiet acts no one sees, the choices made when no one is watching." Jack listened intently, absorbing the weight of the lesson. He realized that every small interaction, every act of thoughtfulness, was part of a larger tapestry of influence. Mr. Anderson's subtle guidance was not just reshaping the community, but also molding Jack's understanding of honor, patience, and empathy. Each gesture, each conversation left impressions that could grow and flourish over years, unseen by most, yet shaping lives in profound ways. Chapter 12. Silent Transformation. As days turned to weeks, the neighborhood's transformation became undeniable. Families once wary of one another now shared meals, offered assistance, and extended warm greetings. The corner deli, once a place of transactional interactions, now resonated with laughter and genuine care. Adults and children alike had begun to internalize the example set by Mr. Anderson, learning that quiet deeds held a power greater than words. Jack took meticulous notes, realizing that the story unfolding before him was not just about heroism, but about the ripple effects of integrity and compassion. Stories of Mr. Anderson's past, once hidden, now cautiously shared, revealed a man who had served his country and community with unwavering commitment. His actions, however small or unnoticed, had cultivated a profound respect and admiration among those around him. One afternoon, sitting on a weathered bench in a secluded garden behind the local library, Mr. Anderson turned to Jack and spoke with a quiet intensity. "Jack, the measure of redemption is not a single moment, but a continuous journey. Every act of kindness, every decision made with conscience plants a seed. Some seeds may take years to bloom, some may never do so, but every choice matters." Jack felt the weight and truth of the statement. He understood that documenting Mr. Anderson's story was not merely capturing heroic feats, it was preserving a lesson in humanity, a testament to how integrity, humility, and quiet courage could change lives. The community had begun to awaken in ways that were both subtle and undeniable. Windows no longer stayed closed in suspicion. Instead, they opened to the sounds of life, of children playing, of conversations that carried across streets like gentle breezes. Mr. Anderson's quiet acts of care had begun to weave an invisible web of trust and admiration. People who had once avoided one another not exchanged not just words but smiles and gestures that carried meaning far deeper than the simple acknowledgement. Jack observed the effects with a growing sense of awe. The elderly veteran would stop to offer advice on fixing a leaky faucet, to help carry groceries, or simply to lend a patient ear. In each instance, he did not seek recognition. Yet in the eyes of those he touched, a transformation was occurring. A man who had once been unknown to them was now a silent pillar, a reference point for decency and integrity. The most skeptical neighbors could not ignore the subtle shift. Their community, once fractured by doubt and fear, was beginning to feel cohesive, alive. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the rooftops, Mr. Anderson and Jack walked along a quiet lane lined with oak trees, their branches brushing against each other like guardians. Jack could sense a deep rhythm in the older man's presence, a careful balance between strength and gentleness. "People often think heroism is grand and loud, Jack, but the real work happens quietly. It's in moments that no one records, no one applauds. It's in how you stand when no one is watching." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of the lesson settle over him. He realized that documenting these moments would not just tell a story of one man, but of a transformative power of integrity and empathy. Each quiet act, each unnoticed kindness, was a seed that would continue to grow, silently, persistently, shaping the world in ways that were both immediate and far-reaching. Days flowed into weeks, and the rhythm of change continued. Shops once wary of visitors now greeted them warmly. Children's laughter filled the air as they ran along sidewalks, and the elderly found companionship in unexpected places. Mr. Anderson's presence had subtly recalibrated the moral compass of the neighborhood, setting an example that resonated without being forceful. Every choice he made, every act of selfless care, acted as a lesson in the unspoken power of integrity. Jack often followed him, not merely to document events, but to witness the human currents shifting beneath the surface. Conversations held in hushed tones at bus stops revealed gratitude and newfound courage. People began to extend themselves in ways they had never dared before. Mothers taught their children to help others. Young men carried groceries for the elderly, and neighbors looked out for one another in quiet, attentive ways. All of this traced back to the influence of a man who lived humbly, yet whose life carried a depth few could comprehend at first glance. One afternoon, while helping repair a playground swing that had fallen into disrepair, Mr. Anderson spoke thoughtfully.
We cannot know how far a single act will reach, Jack. The ripples might circle back to us, or they might reach someone we will never meet. But that does not diminish the value of the act itself. Jack watched him work, saw the care in his hands, the precision in his movements. He realized that Mr. Anderson's life was a masterclass in patience, humility, and quiet courage. There was no need for applause, no need for recognition. Each gesture was a silent curriculum for those willing to observe, to absorb, and emulate. And Jack understood that the story he was recording was not just a narrative of deeds, but a meditation on the human capacity for redemption, honor, and transformation.
Despite the quiet improvements in the neighborhood, echoes of the past clung stubbornly to the edges of Mr. Anderson's presence. Memories of the military campaigns he had endured, of decisions made under impossible pressure, surfaced in moments of solitude. These shadows were never burdensome, but they reminded him of the weight each life carries and the unseen battles that define a person. As he walked down the familiar streets, his steps measured and deliberate, he seemed to carry with him not just his own history, but the history of every life he had touched, every choice that had demanded courage, and every soul left behind. Jack noticed these moments too, the pauses when Mr. Anderson would stop and gaze at a particular building, a corner, or a tree, as though reading some invisible inscription carved by time. The old veteran's eyes held both pain and serenity, a mixture that few could decipher. Yet, even in the quiet reflection, he maintained a sense of purpose that was palpable, influencing those around him without a word. The neighbors, oblivious to the complexity of his past, still found themselves guided by the rhythm of his actions, inspired to reach beyond their own fears and limitations. One evening, while helping an elderly woman carry her groceries, Mr. Anderson shared a fragment of his history with Jack. "I've seen the extremes of human behavior, Jack. Courage and cruelty exist side by side, and often the difference is a single choice. What matters is that we choose wisely, even when no one is watching." Jack felt the weight of those words, the gravity of a lifetime condensed into a few sentences. He realized that Mr. Anderson's true strength lay not in the medals or titles he once held, but in the quiet authority of his conscience. Every act of help, every gentle correction, and every patient explanation became a living testament to what a life of integrity could accomplish, reverberating far beyond the immediate scene, shaping a community and planting seeds for a future he might never witness. As the days turned into weeks, Mr. Anderson's influence became increasingly tangible. Children who once avoided the old man now ran to greet him, carrying small gifts of gratitude, flowers, drawings, and handmade trinkets. Adults in the neighborhood found themselves inspired to offer help without being asked, to carry the weight of someone else's burden in ways that were quiet, unheralded, yet profound. Jack watched closely, documenting moments that felt both ordinary and extraordinary, understanding that the power of one life could ripple outward in ways far greater than a single story might capture. One afternoon, a minor accident at a local construction site became a moment of revelation for the entire community. A scaffolding had begun to collapse, threatening a worker below. Without hesitation, Mr. Anderson leapt into action, steadying the structure and directing others to safety with calm authority. There was no hesitation, no need for recognition. Yet the event left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. The people understood instinctively that courage could be both quiet and absolute, that heroism did not always need to announce itself. "Courage is not always loud, Jack," he said afterward, his voice steady. "It is measured in the moments when action is necessary and in the patience to see consequences before they arrive."
The neighborhood began to see the invisible bridges Mr. Anderson was building. Distrust and suspicion were slowly replaced with trust and mutual care. Small gestures became monumental in their impact. People started forming support networks, looking out for each other, not because of obligation, but because they had witnessed the living example of how empathy and accountability could transform lives. Jack recorded these changes, understanding that the story unfolding before him was more than a tale of one man. It was a demonstration of the silent power of redemption, the tangible consequences of integrity, and the enduring impact of a life lived with conscience as its compass. The quiet rhythm of the neighborhood had begun to shift in subtle ways. Where there had once been suspicion and isolation, there were now interactions filled with patience, curiosity, and respect. Mr. Anderson moved through these streets not as a figure of fear or authority, but a quiet guide whose mere presence invited reflection. He did not seek accolades, he did not ask for recognition, and yet the lessons he imparted were profound, weaving through the community like invisible threads.
Jack began noticing patterns. Children who once shied away from conflict now approached small disagreements with empathy and reasoning, often citing Mr. Anderson's teachings. Adults, too, were subtly transformed. The single mother who had struggled to balance work and childcare began organizing local support groups. The retired shopkeeper, who had long avoided interacting with neighbors, now offered mentorship and guidance. Each person acted as though Mr. Anderson's presence had unlocked a latent potential within them, teaching that courage and compassion are rarely loud, but always consequential. One evening, Mr. Anderson took Jack aside to a quiet corner of the park. He pointed to a group of teenagers gathered near the fountain, laughing and arguing over a trivial matter. "They're testing the boundaries, Jack. Every action, every decision teaches them about themselves. We cannot always intervene, but we can provide an example to reflect against." Jack realized that this was the essence of what he had been witnessing all along. The veteran's influence was subtle yet unwavering, a demonstration of integrity and redemption lived daily. Even in moments of silence, even in gestures so minor that they seemed insignificant, Mr. Anderson's actions shaped the moral fabric of the neighborhood. It was a reminder that heroism is rarely about grand gestures. Often, it is about showing up consistently, embodying values in ways that others can witness, feel, and ultimately emulate. By the following week, the neighborhood was beginning to display a transformation that was almost tangible. The once lonely streets now buzzed with interactions that carried warmth and understanding. Neighbors began to check on each other with a level of care that had been absent for years. A broken fence was repaired collectively. Children were taught lessons of resilience and trust. Elders shared stories, not as reminders of failure, but as lessons of endurance. Mr. Anderson, observing quietly, remained at the center of this shift without claiming any credit. He understood that redemption was not a performance. It was a commitment to action, to living a life that others could learn from, even if indirectly. One afternoon, a young man approached him with a question about leadership. "How do you know what's right when no one is watching?" he asked, his eyes reflecting both curiosity and doubt. "You trust the principles you cannot see, the ones that guide you even when the world is indifferent," Mr. Anderson replied, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Integrity is not measured by applause. It is measured by the choices made in silence." That evening, Jack documented a remarkable scene. The young man, inspired by the conversation, led a group of children to restore a neglected playground, teaching them patience, cooperation, and respect. It was a living testament to the ripple effect of example and mentorship. Every action Mr. Anderson took,
Every word spoken had multiplied quietly across the community, creating tides of change that no headline or recognition could capture.
Days turned into weeks, and the quiet influence of Mr. Anderson continued to weave itself into every corner of the neighborhood. Trust, once fragile and scarce, began to emerge as an unspoken currency. Parents allowed their children to explore with more freedom, confident that the lessons of respect and empathy had taken root. Shopkeepers offered small favors to neighbors, acts that required nothing but an open heart, yet signaled a new rhythm of interconnectedness. Jack observed these subtle shifts with awe. Each gesture, no matter how minor, was a reflection of the veteran's unseen guidance. Like a symphony, conducted without fanfare, each note precise, intentional, and transformative. One afternoon, Jack witnessed an exchange at the corner store that perfectly illustrated this new dynamic. A young woman, struggling to pay for groceries, received a quiet nod from the clerk, who covered the remainder without a word. No applause followed, no announcement. Yet Jack could feel the invisible threads of dignity and compassion being passed from one person to another. It was a small moment, almost imperceptible, yet it contained the weight of years of unseen mentorship. Mr. Anderson, standing a few feet away, merely smiled, acknowledging the ripple effect he had set into motion without ever seeking acknowledgement. Later that evening, Mr. Anderson invited Jack to walk with him along the empty streets. The quiet was punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustle of leaves. "These moments, Jack, are where transformation truly resides," he said. "Not in the noise, not in the recognition, but in the choices we make when no one is watching. Every act of integrity, every display of empathy creates an unseen tapestry of influence that shapes the world around us." Jack understood then that heroism was not defined by headline-worthy actions. It existed in patience, in consistency, in the quiet courage to do what is right, day after day. Redemption, Mr. Anderson demonstrated, was not a destination. It was a continuous, deliberate process that reshaped hearts and minds quietly, invisibly, but irreversibly. The weeks that followed brought a visible transformation in the neighborhood. Whereas once tension and distrust had lingered, there was now an emerging sense of hope. Children played freely in the streets, their laughter weaving through the alleyways as parents watched with cautious optimism. Elderly neighbors engaged in long conversations, sharing stories of resilience and learning from one another. Even the local community center, previously underused and neglected, began to flourish, as workshops and meetings were organized to teach skills, instill values, and nurture leadership. Mr. Anderson, ever the silent architect, remained at the center of this subtle revolution. One afternoon, Jack noticed a group of teenagers gathered to repaint a mural in the community park. The image was symbolic, figures standing together, diverse yet unified, representing strength, empathy, and the quiet power of communal effort. Each brushstroke was deliberate, each gesture a reflection of the values Mr. Anderson had quietly imparted. It was not a public declaration, nor did it require recognition, but the mural became a beacon of transformation, a visible manifestation of hope nurtured in silence. Jack followed the teenagers, documenting their efforts, and was struck by the way they collaborated, how disputes were resolved not with anger but through reasoned conversation, negotiation, and empathy. He realized that Mr. Anderson's mentorship had taken root in ways that exceeded any of his expectations. Redemption had become tangible, expressed in acts that were both grand and small, in choices made without expectation of reward. "The true measure of change, Jack," Mr. Anderson said, "is not in what people say, but in how they live. Notice how these young ones carry forward what they have learned without any prompting. They are the embodiment of hope that arises when guidance is patient, steady, and grounded in principle." Jack felt a swell of emotion, knowing that the neighborhood had become a living testament to the enduring power of quiet leadership, integrity, and the ripple effect of a single, consistent moral compass. It was the emergence of hope, cultivated in silence, witnessed in life,
and felt in the hearts of all who called the streets home. The neighborhood had entered a phase where every action spoke louder than any proclamation. Jack noticed that the elderly residents, inspired by the veterans' example, had begun forming informal councils to assist younger families. It was subtle at first, helping carry groceries, fixing a broken fence, but soon these acts of neighborly solidarity became intentional, coordinated, and profoundly transformative. Children watched these interactions with wide eyes, absorbing lessons that no textbook could provide, witnessing integrity and compassion unfold naturally, in real time. Mr. Anderson often walked silently among the residents, observing without interrupting, allowing the lessons to unfold organically. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and cast long shadows across the streets, Jack and Mr. Anderson paused near a small park bench. Families gathered around, sharing food and laughter, unaware of the subtle mentorship at work. "Every choice matters," Mr. Anderson said softly. "Every moment where you act with integrity, every decision where you choose compassion over indifference, sets a precedent. Influence is not about commanding. It's about embodying principles so fully that others cannot help but mirror them." Later that night, Jack reflected on the power of silent leadership. Mr. Anderson's life was a testament to the idea that redemption is not announced but lived. The neighborhood's transformation had begun with a single act of kindness, yet it had grown into a living, breathing ecosystem of empathy and moral courage. Jack realized that these moments, as small as they seemed, were creating a foundation strong enough to sustain hope for generations. The following days brought a rhythm that had once been unimaginable in the neighborhood. Community members, inspired by the veterans' example, began organizing projects without guidance or instruction. They painted walls, cleaned streets, and created informal after-school programs for the children. Each act, though ordinary in isolation, contributed to a sense of cohesion and purpose that had been missing for decades. Jack watched in awe as the energy of collective effort transformed the physical and emotional landscape. One afternoon, a minor dispute erupted between two teenagers over a shared responsibility in the community garden. Jack expected conflict, but to his astonishment, the disagreement was resolved peacefully, each side listening carefully, negotiating compromises, and ultimately collaborating. It was a living example of the principles that Mr. Anderson had instilled quietly, through observation and subtle guidance. The architects of change are not always those who speak the loudest. They are the ones who live their values so consistently that others adopt them naturally. Watch closely, Jack. This is how communities endure. Jack's journal filled with observations of subtle transformations, each entry documenting the ripple effect of quiet, consistent integrity. He began to see the threads connecting each act, the invisible network of empathy, patience, and understanding that now defined the neighborhood. Redemption, he realized, was not a personal achievement. It was a communal awakening, a series of deliberate, heartfelt choices multiplied across countless lives. And at the center of it all stood the man who had taught them, not through words alone, but through the enduring strength of character. As autumn descended on the neighborhood, the subtle glow of change became more visible. Trees shed their golden leaves onto sidewalks that had once seemed neglected, mirroring the transformation taking place in the hearts of those who walked them. Mr. Anderson, ever observant, noticed how even the smallest gestures of responsibility and empathy radiated outward. Families who had once been isolated, mistrustful of one another, now exchanged greetings, shared meals, and collaborated on projects that enriched the entire community. Jack accompanied Mr. Anderson during one of his daily walks, a ritual that had become a study in human resilience and adaptation. They passed the corner store, where an elderly shopkeeper smiled warmly at a group of children carrying painted planters. Jack marveled at how the veteran's presence seemed to encourage civility and kindness without a single command. It was as though the man's quiet authority rewrote social norms simply by existing among them. "You see, Jack," Mr. Anderson said, eyes tracing the children tending the garden. Influence is rarely about loud speeches or dramatic gestures. It is in consistency, in the quiet commitment to doing right even when no one is watching. The light of integrity is never wasted. It finds its way to those who need it most. Later, Jack sat at his desk documenting the day's events, noticing patterns that were almost imperceptible to the casual observer. One act of generosity led to another, creating a chain reaction that now included nearly every household on the street. This invisible network of care was the true measure of Mr. Anderson's redemption. Not headlines, not recognition, but the transformation of a community from distrust to hope, from fear to empathy. Winter approached, and with it, the quiet rhythms of change had solidified into tangible routines. Children, inspired by the example set by Mr. Anderson, began tutoring one another, sharing books, and participating in improvised workshops. Parents, once disengaged or skeptical, now took pride in their neighborhood and invested time in nurturing not only their children but the collective welfare of the community. Jack observed a group of teenagers repairing a dilapidated basketball court. He realized the significance of these seemingly small contributions. Each hammer strike, each painted line was a symbolic reclamation of dignity. This was the true power of Mr. Anderson's invisible influence, moments that appeared ordinary yet carried profound moral weight, demonstrating that redemption is not a single act, but a sustained, transformative presence. And as the snow began to lightly dust the streets, Jack knew that the lessons of Mr. Anderson would echo for generations to come, silent yet undeniable, shaping the hearts of those who had learned to see the value of quiet greatness. The first snow settled softly across the neighborhood, blanketing streets and rooftops with a fragile, pristine layer. The cold air carried a stillness that made every sound, footsteps crunching on frost, the distant hum of traffic, the laughter of children playing, feel amplified and purposeful. Jack walked alongside Mr. Anderson, noticing how even in the harshest conditions, the veteran's influence remained a constant, unshakable presence. Mr. Anderson paused at the edge of a small park, watching a group of homeless men huddle near a fire barrel. Their eyes, wary and guarded, reflected a lifetime of neglect and survival instinct. Without a word, he approached them with quiet dignity, offering blankets and hot coffee. The men hesitated at first, uncertainty etched into their features, but the calm authority radiating from him dissolved their defenses. They accepted his help, not with words of gratitude, but with a recognition of respect, something they had rarely encountered in their daily lives.
Jack observed, taking note of the subtle transformations. A man once hostile now smiled faintly, eyes softening as he accepted the blanket. Another, who had scowled at passers-by moments before, now spoke gently to a younger companion, imparting lessons learned from years of survival. Mr. Anderson's redemption, Jack realized, was measured not in accolades or recognition, but in the reclamation of humanity from those who had been forgotten. "It is the snow that tests us," Mr. Anderson said, his voice steady against the wind. "True strength is revealed when you act for others, not for fame or reward. The snow will melt, the fire will die, but the impact of compassion endures far longer than we imagine." Jack felt a deep, resonant understanding. He began recording every gesture, every unspoken interaction, recognizing that the essence of heroism lay in ordinary acts of courage performed consistently over time, shaping the moral fabric of an entire community. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Jack noticed the growing network of connections within the neighborhood. What had once been a scattered, fragmented community now exhibited signs of cohesion. Neighbors shared resources, checked on one another, and collaborated in small but meaningful projects, repairing fences, tending gardens, organizing food drives.
Every action was a thread in an intricate tapestry of resilience, compassion, and restored dignity. Mr. Anderson, ever watchful, guided these interactions not through overt direction, but by example. His presence alone set a standard of accountability and empathy that others unconsciously mirrored. Children who had once ignored their elders now assisted them with chores and errands. Teenagers, inspired by his consistent moral compass, mediated disputes with patience and tact. Even the most hardened adults began to reassess their assumptions about responsibility and honor. One afternoon, Jack watched as Mr. Anderson intervened in a heated disagreement between two families over property boundaries. His calm voice cut through the tension like sunlight breaking a storm cloud, and soon both parties were listening, understanding, and ultimately compromising. Jack noted that the veteran never imposed solutions. He facilitated awareness, allowing others to discover empathy and fairness on their own. "The bridges we build," Mr. Anderson said, pointing to a narrow wooden bridge over a frozen creek, "are not always visible or permanent, but they connect people in ways that matter most. Trust, respect, understanding, these are the true structures that hold communities together." Jack's notebook filled with observations that captured more than events. They documented transformations of character, small victories of human dignity, and the ripple effects of quiet leadership. In the frost-covered streets, amidst the sound of children laughing and neighbors working together, he recognized that Mr. Anderson's life had become a blueprint for redemption, not in grand gestures, but in enduring, patient, and consistent acts of integrity.
Winter deepened. Days bled into nights in a quiet rhythm that only those who had known true solitude could appreciate. The snow on the ground had hardened into thick, icy sheets that glittered under streetlights like fractured glass. Mr. Anderson moved slower these days, his joints stiff, his breath shallow, but his gaze remained unbroken, the same steady eyes that had seen both the best and worst of humanity. Jack often visited him in the evenings, bringing dinner or simply keeping him company in the small, dimly lit living room. The walls were adorned with framed memories, photos of soldiers, folded flags, a tarnished medal or two. Yet in that modest home, the weight of silence said more than any relic ever could. It was the silence of a man who had made peace with his ghosts, but still carried them, like unseen scars across his soul. One night, as wind howled through the cracks in the old wooden windows, Jack finally asked the question that had haunted him since he'd learned the truth. "Why did you never tell anyone who you really were?" Mr. Anderson looked toward the flickering light of the small heater. His voice emerged calm, almost tender. "Because medals fade, Jack. Titles fade. But the man you are when no one's watching, that's what remains. I needed to prove to myself that I could live without the armor of reputation. Only then could I know peace." The room fell silent again. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the world in a blanket of forgiveness. Jack realized that the veteran's greatest act of courage had not been on the battlefield, but in his choice to live humbly, quietly, anonymously. A man stripped of recognition, yet rich in purpose. Later that night, when Jack walked home, he passed by the park where Mr. Anderson often sat. A single set of footprints led to the bench, then disappeared beneath the snow. Jack stood there for a long while, breathing the frozen air, understanding that every step the old man took was a lesson in dignity, one written not for history books, but for the heart. A few weeks later, Jack received a small, unmarked envelope slipped under his door. The handwriting was firm but aged, each letter shaped with deliberate care. Inside, he found a folded piece of parchment and an old photograph, a black and white image of a group of young soldiers standing together in dusty uniforms, their faces half lit by the desert sun. Mr. Anderson stood at the center, his expression unreadable, his posture straight and proud. The letter began simply. Jack, if you are reading this, it means I've gone where battles finally end. I never wanted my story to be about me. It was always about the people who find light even after they've lost faith in it. You were one of them. You saw past the dirt, the wrinkles, the silence. You saw the man beneath the myths. Thank you for that. Don't let this story die with me. Pass it on, not as a tale of war, but as proof that redemption doesn't belong to the powerful, but to the humble. Tears blurred Jack's vision. He read the letter over and over, each line more heavy and beautiful than the last. The next morning, he rushed to Mr. Anderson's home. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was as he had left it, the heater humming, the armchair facing the window, but the man himself was gone, peacefully, as if the dawn had quietly carried him away. Jack sat in silence, the letter clutched in his trembling hands. The old soldier had left him no fortune, no possessions, only a legacy carved into the quiet acts of kindness that had transformed an entire neighborhood.
That evening, the snow began to fall again, and for the first time, Jack didn't feel the cold. He felt presence. He felt peace. Weeks passed, yet the absence of Mr. Anderson was felt in every corner of the neighborhood. His chair at the park remained empty, but no one dared to remove it. The children still played near it, whispering stories they'd heard about the old man who once fed the pigeons and smiled like someone who knew secrets no one else could. The adults spoke his name with quiet respect, as though invoking a saint. Jack began to notice something remarkable. People who had once ignored one another now stopped to talk. Neighbors shared food, helped fix fences, offered rides to work. It was as if the humility and kindness that Mr. Anderson embodied had taken root in everyone he'd touched. The small community that had once been divided by indifference was now bound together by compassion. One day, while cleaning out Mr. Anderson's old house, Jack found a hidden drawer beneath the floorboards. Inside lay a collection of handwritten letters, newspaper clippings, and photographs, a secret archive of the man's quiet influence. There were thank-you notes from families he'd helped anonymously, records of scholarships paid in cash, even receipts for medical bills covered without anyone knowing who the benefactor had been. Jack realized the depth of the old man's generosity. He had used his remaining wealth not for comfort or recognition, but to rebuild lives in silence. And now, even in death, his spirit continued to do the same, teaching that true power is not in being remembered, but in being felt. The story of the homeless veteran who owned the military base spread far beyond the city. News outlets picked it up, social media turned it viral, and soon people across the country began donating to veteran shelters, starting community projects, and offering jobs to former soldiers. The ripple of one man's humility had reached thousands. But Jack never sought to profit or to take credit. He simply told the truth, the way Mr. Anderson had lived it, stripped of embellishment, yet overflowing with meaning. Every time he spoke at a school, a radio station, or a local hall, he carried that same message. You never truly know who you're helping. And sometimes the smallest act of kindness is enough to save a soul. A year later, the town held a small ceremony at the park where Mr. Anderson had spent most of his final days. Veterans from nearby cities attended, some in old uniforms, others in plain clothes. No grand speeches, no medals, just silence, the kind that carried respect deeper than any applause could. Jack stood by the bench that had become a symbol of quiet strength. On it rested a bronze plaque that read, "To the man who taught us that honor is not in rank, but in grace." The air was cold that morning, the sky painted in muted shades of gray. A group of children placed flowers at the foot of the bench, while an elderly soldier raised his hand in salute. The gesture was slow, deliberate, the kind of salute reserved not for generals or heroes, but for those who had lived with integrity. As the crowd dispersed, Jack remained. He thought of the first day he met Mr. Anderson, the shivering old man beneath a torn blanket, whom he had mistaken for someone broken. Now he understood. The man had never been broken. He had been rebuilding himself in silence, piece by piece, until the world was ready to remember him, not for his past, but for his heart. That night, Jack walked through the snow once more, retracing the same path they used to take together. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and for a moment he felt that familiar presence beside him, the quiet wisdom, the steady calm. He stopped, looked up, and whispered, "Rest easy, sir. The world finally sees you." The wind carried his words away, but somewhere beyond the veil of memory and time they were heard. Because legends are not built from glory. They're born from redemption. And in that truth, Mr. Anderson lived forever, not as a forgotten veteran, not as the secret owner of a base, but as a man who proved that the greatest battles are won in silence.